It is critical for quality and validation professionals to stay on the pulse of emerging policies and regulations. From the FDA's Computer Software Assurance Draft to the newly released EU Medical Device General Safety and Performance Guidance, evolving regulations are a constant. Our network of professionals cover these topics and more in print, in person, and online, bringing the latest industry news and tools to our audience of hardworking experts just like you. The IVT Network gives you the tools you need to succeed in your profession, providing innovative content, industry research, lifelong learning, and opportunities for networking on a global level. For our listeners, receive 15 months for the price of 12 plus an exclusive discount with your new subscription. Subscribe today with IVT Network, the best decision you'll make all year for your life sciences career.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacy.
Thank you, and welcome to Risk Revolution, a monthly series of the Voices in Validation podcast brought to you by the IVT Network. The goal of this series is to advance the maturity of risk management practices within industry, addressing topics that challenge quality professionals to seek opportunities to improve and advance the ways in which they perceive and manage risk. This week, our series coordinators, Lori and Nuala, invite their guest, Amanda McFarland, to chat about living the risk life. How do we take our colleagues on a journey from dreading their participation in the risk process to actually living a workplace life and culture that embraces risk management? So thank you, Lori and Nuala, for being with us today. And of course, thank you so much, Amanda, for joining us as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Stacey. It's great to be back with you again. And I have to say, I'm really looking forward to our topic today, exploring the mindsets necessary to underpin the effective management of risk. You know, when we last met, we had a great discussion on facilitation, friend or foe, as we coined that one. And of course, the importance of that facilitation in the whole risk management process. And, you know, we covered a lot around how that facilitator plays a critical role in getting to the right answers. And so today we felt that it's worth going that extra mile now to take the concept even further and discuss the mindset and even that mindfulness, because that's the de rigueur word, but certainly the mindsets needed behind the risk management process. And really ask, how do we move the people from that dreading the risk process to living the risk life? So over to you, Lori. Are you excited about today's topic?
Yes, I am. And I think it's great that we're actually kind of owning that people really feel that way and giving it a name. I think people sometimes feel bad when they go, oh, I got to go to one of Lori's risk assessments. But I think talking about it and helping get us to a different place where maybe we're really living that life will give us a better energy and a different when we're getting into that space. So I'm looking forward to it. And I know, Amanda, I'm going to turn it over to you. You've had lots of experience with this as well. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts too.
Yeah, that's right. So thank you so much for having me here with you guys to have this discussion. And I agree with both of you. Naming the fact that this is something that is dreadful or people don't want to participate in, I think is really the first step. You know, having people come into a risk assessment and sort of forcing themselves to believe that they want to be there, it's obvious, right? Or they're not even forcing themselves. They just look angry about it. I personally have experienced that side of things, but I've also seen the great value that risk assessments bring. And so really being honest with ourselves about how we're setting up this risk management process and the sort of tone that we give it, I think can help us turn a new corner.
Yeah, I'm looking forward. So I wanted to get us started today just on a little word association game. to get us into the right mindset, because dare I say, the three of us probably rather enjoy talking about this topic. So we were going to have to get ourselves into the mindset of dreading talking about risk. So I thought this would be a little fun. I've done this with groups too. So I'll start with Amanda. What are the things you hear from participants when they hear the word risk? What are some words you hear from them?
That it's dangerous, something has gone wrong, there's shame, fear about those risks. It's always just kind of this negative connotation that it's scary, it's unknown.
Yeah, I love that. And Nuala, I know she just used one of your favorite words about shame. What do you hear when you tell people, let's talk about risk? What do you hear from people?
Yeah. And typically people approach the concept of risk as something that has to be avoided, at all costs, that it's a bad thing. And that we have to survive it rather than just thrive with it. But of course, every business is operating on a risk threshold. So, I'd like us to today, at the end of this, be really looking at how can we thrive in that environment of risk rather than just merely survive the process.
Yeah. And I'd like to kind of mirror, I know we always, Nuala and I tend to bring up a lot, Amanda, at the Risk Revolution. We talk a lot about the vaccination kind of world right now. And we sort of draw some parallels there. And I'd like to say that we did take a lot of risk there in the industry. The world is taking a risk right now. And a lot of places it's really paying off, that speed that we pushed that vaccination technology through. I think it challenged a lot of us, but I think those places where that vaccination rate is fairly high are seeing some success from that. So I agree. I'd like to see us spin risk a little differently at times, although I'd like to also say be risk curious, right? Yeah. Really look at that risk. It doesn't mean we're because we love talking about risk management, doesn't mean we're running out taking risks all over the place with reckless abandon, right? It's understanding and talking about it. So I love that.
Yeah, and Laurie, there's one other thing while we're on the word association thing that I'd really like to approach head on here. One of the terms that either is misused or abused in our lexicon around the risk management process is risk mitigation. Mm-hmm. And, we talk about risk mitigation all the time, or people think they're talking about risk mitigation, but in fact, what they're trying to talk about is risk prevention or risk reduction. But actually, the term that gets used all the time is, how are we going to mitigate that risk? How are we going to, how are we going to do risk mitigation? And for me, I think it's really important when we go to the catalogs, whether it's the bioprocessing or the chemical industry or the safety industry, when you look at the term risk mitigation, it is simply about managing the aftermath of the risk event. It is assuming the risk event has happened or will happen, and therefore risk mitigation is about reducing the impacts or the consequences of that. And it immediately jumps into what can we do after the fire has broken out, rather than, again, moving over to the left of our bow tie or our barrier analysis model that we talk about in this podcast all the time, of really focusing in on risk reduction and risk avoidance and risk acceptance, those other terms, but they don't get bandied about nearly as much in our risk process. People just jump into this mitigation, not realizing that they've already given up the ghost and accepted that the risk event is going to happen in the first case, and now all they're doing is mopping up the flood, from the sprinkler system. So I'd really like us to kind of get people to think about the fact that we don't just have to mitigate risk. We can avoid it, we can prevent it, we can reduce it. We can substitute it. There's a whole host of things in the hierarchy of controls that we can do way before we want to get to the point where we're mopping up the aftermath.
That's great. Now, see, we're already too energized again. We're not in our dread phases.
Dreading.
We got to dread.
But Nuala brings up a really interesting point just around the lexicon itself. The most common term that I hear now is not risk control, risk mitigation, risk prevention, or detection. The words that are being used are, we'll risk this out.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Like,
yes.
What risk it out? Like, you're going to add risk to it? Like, And this is where it's really challenging to be a facilitator, because the intent is there. The intent is that we want to reduce our risks or prevent our risks, but we've somehow allowed these coined terms to come into play that misrepresent the intent, or it's like somehow we're going to get out of the risk, which we will never do. I mean, we can, but it's very unlikely. But that's one of those things that I just cringe. And I am not joking that I've seen this on billboards in Cambridge, Mass. Risk it out.
Yep.
Yeah. So from a lexicon perspective, you're spot on.
That's a great one. I also, so we'll jump to risk assessment and what we hear with that. And I often hear that term a lot of times used after something's happened, back to the Nuala, after. So let's do a risk assessment on that. I'm like, it's already happened. You've now got an issue you've got to deal with, right? The pipe has broken, the flood has started, right? But in addition to risk assessment, some of the language I hear is, how long is it going to take? Should we block out a week? I'm going to have to, I'm going to grab so-and-so because I'm going to be off on Wednesday. So they're going to sit in for me. What are some things that you hear, Amanda, that are kind of like that, sort of heavy feeling?
Very similar. Always, how long? How long will this take? These are too complicated.
Oh,
which
yes.
I think is something that we can adjust over time. We can begin to influence that complicated element. It's a waste of time because I know what the risks are.
Oh, yes.
So I hear that quite a bit. I don't need a risk assessment to tell me where something can go wrong. And so it's sort of this, you need the risk assessment to document those things, to monitor those things. I mean, there's a lot of robustness there, but I think it's really a real lack of understanding of the life cycle that leads to this negative connotation with a single part of the life cycle.
Yeah. Nuala, how about you with risk assessment? What are some things you hear from folks?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. So often it's a retrospective, we're justifying our actions. Now, let's just get that risk assessment to line up exactly with how that decision that we've already made, on the back of a Kellogg's box. Let's just use the process to get it done. So I totally agree with that. But so often, even in the prospective risk assessment, you'll see that, we just have to get this done rather than we need to do it. It's a milestone. So sometimes it's holding up the next progress, and we just want to get it done and get it out of the way. And rather than, that we need to do it because it'll strengthen the process, so that's another one there.
Okay. So now I'm officially like mad face emoji because those are all things I hear too. I'm all sad. So now that we're in the right space in our head, I want us to take us through now the rest of this podcast. I've kind of sort of thought through this process. We talked offline about how to kind of phase this. Let's start with dreading the process then. And I want to start with Amanda and kind of get your, what does that look like? What does that mean when we dread the risk process?
I think it's good to think about this in terms of scenarios that I myself have seen, and I'm sure the two of you have also been part of, where an observation is made or an inspector comes in and they take a look at the facility or a process or part of the process and say, I think you should, I think you should. That would be great if they were so kind to say, I think you should. But they say, perform a risk assessment on X, Y, and Z. And so immediately there's a lot of eyes on this assessment itself. And this can be a good thing because suddenly there's an awareness that, I've got to get this risk assessment done. It's also a negative because there's pressure. So now I have to perform an activity that culturally I'm not typically really fond of. And not only is the agency looking at me, but multiple layers of the organization are looking to this team to overcome this in the shortest amount of time with the most comprehensive response that they possibly can. And typically that timing is a bit unreasonable. So it's not allowing for the team to really do a full investigation, really understand the problem and move forward. that when we have situations like that, we're forcing the team into exactly what Nuala said. Hey, perform a risk assessment that justifies the current state of activities, which is not what we should be using risk assessments at all. And through that, you'll commonly see, you always have people in organizations that are really interested in getting to the root of problem or the causes, and sometimes they're silenced, right? Risk assessments can sometimes give them an opportunity to speak up, but in these situations, it's plow ahead, move forward. Those people start to feel really deflated, even if they started with a positive mindset about risk management. They feel deflated. The process owner feels they're to blame because the risk assessment is being asked for to begin with. And there's just this tense situation. These tough decisions are being made by people who are not able to think through their problem sufficiently. It's a rush process. And I'm talking about that, and I don't want to be part of those risk assessments. And I love risk management. So just thinking about what are the circumstances that are leading to this? This is one of those circumstances that I see one of the problems that we have that gets us in the dread zone.
Oh, I loved what you just said, even because, while I commented that the three of us, we love to talk about risk. So true, Amanda, that I dread it as a facilitator when I find out the timeline and I find out how much I'm going to be rushed. And because we see the value in how this can drive great decision making, right? Or informing great decision making. So totally with you. That's where I feel the dread then is Nuala, how about you? What does that look like when we're dreading the risk process?
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick up on one term that Amanda used there, just as a starter, and maybe we'll come back to it later. But you mentioned that there's a problem. And everyone is like, okay, now there's a problem because an inspector or someone has raised, where's your risk assessment, or it's not adequate. Now you need to do another one. I want to see your risk assessment. And now it's a problem. And this is this shift in mindset that we need to do. I regularly talk about risk management is not a compliance requirement. It's a business capability. It's a set of skills that the business has that enables it to do its best work every day, not spend all its time, putting out the fires that we regularly talk about. So we've got to shift that from it being a problem to it being an opportunity. And that's the shift. Now, I'll come back to that later, but just to this dreading the process piece, I think we can look at it at two ends of the spectrum. Again, that prospective or retrospective. So even in a prospective ideal world, you've got a new facility or a new suite or a new piece of equipment, new product introduction, and obviously risk management and risk assessments are part of that plan. And it's still not unusual, even in those new project environments, that the teams, even if they're cross-functional teams, are still working in silos. So you might have a cross-functional team, but they're the new product introduction team, or they're the tech transfer team, or they're the whatever. And they're working in a silo in terms of they've got their schedule, they've got their Gantt charts, they've got their deliverables, and they're plowing ahead on that basis. And again, even in those cases, the risk management activity comes in on their project milestones. And now back to what I said, it's about getting it done rather than getting it right. And so it's how quickly can we get through this process, even though we haven't even started production yet? It's not like we've had an inspector telling us to get this done. It still tends to come at a point that they can't progress to the next phase of their project until this key milestone of the risk management activities are completed. And again, it falls into that it's a problem now for us rather than an opportunity. And if they were looking even in those prospective situations of it as an opportunity to really stress test their current assumptions and design, not just in a formal design review, but to actually challenge the team rather than have them get defensive, because they've been working in this little silo. They've been working towards getting this, product or project up and running. And they can become very defensive. I think I've said this to you before, Laurie, it's the ugly baby syndrome. This project has become their baby and they don't want you to tell them it's ugly. So they can become very, blame-centered or defensive about it, instead of actually coming in with a completely open mindset and saying, okay, we have done some fantastic work as a team. And one of the things that I really always like to do with teams at this stage is actually get the patient in there again. Obviously we can't drag a patient into our meeting rooms or our virtual Zooms, but start with a slide or two on the patient and re-ground them about keeping a straight line of sight to that patient. And then you can get them to really explore the inherent weaknesses that might have been, that might emerge in their silo-based thinking. And then, of course, on the other end of the spectrum, as mentioned, we have those retrospective risk assessments, say emerging from an investigation. And depending on how high the stakes are, is it a batch rejection? Is it a product recall? Teams can, get really focused on about allocating blame rather than finding the true root cause, which we talked about with our friend Rob a couple of weeks ago. So again, the emphasis ends up shifting onto how can we make this problem go away, rather than getting it right and getting that root cause identified. So in either case, the mindset is all wrong. Like you say, we have to encourage people to get back to that being curious. It's that curiosity, creativity, and innovation that we want to bring into these risk assessments, rather than, we're all sitting in a room and we're looking at 100 lines of an Excel spreadsheet at 0.6 font, and we're dead. We're dead in the water then already. So yeah, that's my take on it.
I've gotten too old for the 9 font even. I'm like, can you move that up to 12? So I think I loved your answers, Nuala. I think we do need to shift that mindset. And I think that kind of jumps us into the next question. Amanda, I'll look for you to answer this one. Is what are some key behaviors to embrace that move us out of dreading the risk process? And I think one thing that you said, Nuala, that kind of jumped me into that question too was, even those design risk assessments, which I'm working on some as well in my place. There's so much to do too that can come out of that, not just even for the design and looking at maybe equipment that you're purchasing, but also the SOPs you need to write, the trainings you need to consider. There's so much information that can come as outputs of these risk assessments that I think somehow, I'm not sure we're always verbalizing that or something, but I think that's one tip that I would feed into that question. But Amanda, you've got lots more to add. How do we move out of that sort of dread of the risk process? What's kind of a first step?
So is this getting us out of the funk, or are these behaviors? This is getting us out of the funk.
Yeah. So some of the key behaviors that will move us out of I like the word, the funk. Maybe we should have titled it that. The risk funk. Yeah.
As far as those behaviors, I feel, thinking about what Nuala said about the silos is my number one behavior change, that we really need to stop the nonsense of having these silos in place, and really, providing some sense of encouragement around the cross-functional element. If that means having individual risk practitioners that are out there that are cross-functional and helping enable that, that's definitely something to look at, but also to think about, is there a culture of risk bullying within the context of your organization? Is it always a check the box activity, like to move from that to show the value? So when I talked about the example of the requested risk assessment from an inspector, there's a very inherent goal there. The goal is to satisfy that requirement. But if we, as an organization, you're able to alter that perspective, or from a leadership perspective, give new perspective on what that really means. We didn't have this risk assessment. This is why we're doing it. This is the benefit that it will allow us to achieve as a result of performing it. It's like, yeah, it's a real bummer that we didn't identify this or self-identify this risk assessment, but now we're doing it. And what is the true value of that? So I think sort of having a change in perspective can really help. And that requires a lot of self-reflection and self-awareness when we're leading an organization. Thinking about who's leading those risk assessments. So the individuals that are leading risk assessments have the best opportunity to influence the behaviors, coming to the table with empathy, using some soft skills with the team to acknowledge that people come to risk assessments, and when they walk in, it's like everybody is so vulnerable. How terrifying is that? How much trouble am I going to be in? How many CAPAs am I going to be assigned? How many failures will there be that I didn't self-identify? So I think, I always tell my teams, hey, look, I know we're all going to feel a little vulnerable here so that we're not vulnerable later. Like this is that safe place. This is that opportunity to have those discussions. And one resource that myself and my colleague Jim Vesper have done quite a bit of listening to and research on is Amy Edmondson's research on psychological safety. So what does it mean to create a team that feels comfortable talking about their vulnerabilities together? And it's interesting because, Lori and I work together, and we know that within the engineering world, there's a lot of real, it's black or white, it's ones and zeros. And when you walk into a risk assessment, this is the greatest opportunity to see that there's a spectrum, but that is inherently terrifying to people who spend their lives in a scientific discipline where there's a right answer, and navigating this land of uncertainty and allowing people to do that with curiosity and to know that they're embraced, I think is really our best effort at creating these behaviors of moving forward to a more positive mindset.
I love that. I loved the quote. I wrote that down. The vulnerable now, so we're not vulnerable later. I love that because that's one of the. I love the whole concept of even acknowledging the vulnerability in a risk assessment, but even putting that context to it, like, oh, you know what? Yeah, let me open up now because I don't want to have to do that later, right? When things are broken or things are identified in inspection or things just aren't working out, right? I think that's really, really powerful. And I think some of the things you noted, just even the self-reflection, self-awareness, I kind of tied that into the emotional intelligence piece that I think is so undervalued in this risk management process, and hence why we're having this podcast. I thought that was a really powerful answer, Amanda. So Nuala, what other kind of behaviors maybe came to mind when that vulnerability and sort of that discussion of self-reflection, self-awareness, all of those things Amanda brought up then came to mind for you?
Yeah. Obviously we talked about the negative behaviors that can be there, about that, feeling judged or blamed, and you're trying to overcome them. So for me, I touched on it earlier, that maintaining a clear line of sight to the patient, building that empathy early in the process so that we take the emphasis off the egos in the room, because we've got subject matter experts, so there's ego. And so taking the emphasis off the individuals in the room, whether that's from a blame perspective or whether it's from a power-based perspective, and getting the emphasis, recalibrating everybody onto why are we here? Well, we're here to protect the patient, and what's good for the patient is good for the business. So, and you can build that empathy, because now it becomes a safe place to be able to say, well, did we do a good job there, or could we have done better? Because we're not having a go at somebody else in the room who might have had a vested stake in that. You're actually, acting as an advocate on behalf of the patient. So I think that is one of the things of building empathy. And that, it encourages you to admit weaknesses in whether it's the process, the principles, or the practices that are under review. And it makes it a safe space to be able to do that. But for me, the other thing, and I know, I mean, Laurie, this is the subject of your own research. For me, the risk assessment or the risk management process is a primary pillar in building a learning organization. And so therefore, risk assessments need to be viewed through the lens of learning. They are an opportunity to get people around the table and share a whole host of knowledge, that tacit institutional know-how, with the other colleagues around the table who might be working on the same project, but because they're operating in their silo, are just not familiar with some of the stuff that you've been working on. So actually, making that a safe space, but also making it a learning space, those teachable moments, is one of the things. And we're such big fanzines of Brene Brown here, but she always says, integrity is choosing courage over comfort. So I love that, that you can be courageous. It's a space that you can speak up and you can be courageous and question things. And that's seen as a good thing, that curiosity again of why not, or why do we do it this way? So telling people that this is a space where they can be a learner instead of that knower, is a really, one way of getting them to shift in terms of that knowledge sharing. But actually, one of the resources I'm going to share after in our takeaways, it just occurred to me, one of the things that I use very regularly, both in the work that I do around risk management and the work that we do around culture change, is the Khalil Jameson 12 inclusive behaviors. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they talk about the different inclusive behaviors for high performing teams. And they split them into these judging behaviors and versus joining behaviors. And, they say when we feel judged, we act smaller and contribute less. Whereas when we feel joined into the process, we feel big and we contribute more. So again, very routinely at the beginning of risk assessments or any kind of team, building or brainstorming sessions, I would routinely bring these judging versus joining and behaviors up, and just get them to start, thinking about this as an opening slide. And it talks about, it's not about the person, it's about the issue or the work. It's not about sizing up. It's about accepting. It's not about evaluating. It's about exploring. I, not we, in the judging. We, not I. Again, problem finding in the judging behaviors as opposed to problem solving in the joining behaviors, open thinking, letting go of the past and extending trust, that building trust, as opposed to if you're judging, you're withholding your trust from the environment. So they're all that Khalil Jameson 12 inclusive behaviors is a fantastic way. And if we could get that built into the beginning of our risk assessments, I think that would really help to move the needle in terms of behaviors that we observe then in the process.
I love that. I love the judging versus joining, just even thinking about our own behaviors. I was reflecting while you were saying that. I think that makes a lot of sense to me, and I'd love to include that. I did want to also make sure to reiterate what you said about the patients. I do think at times, depending on where we are in the phase of a type of risk assessment we're doing, we can at times lose sight of that. And I'm not implying that we, always forget the patient. That is not what I'm saying at all. It's just depending on where we are in a project, sometimes we just get so tied into the timelines of the construction of the building or the qualification of the lab that we forget sometimes that ultimately that is that end result, right? And so I think having those moments to reflect and remind ourselves does change that perception, I think, a little bit more of, hey, it's not about blaming you about how you designed your process. It's about how we can make the process best designed for the patient, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that shift sort of changes that. So I do want to kind of remind ourselves of that, because even myself as a longtime risk practitioner, I get tied into the project timelines too, right? Hey, we got to get this approved. We got to get this finished. We're coming up to design review, or what have you. And you just sort of forget sometimes, unbeknownst to you, that is the ultimate goal of why we're all doing what we do anyway. So I think that's a great reminder. And I personally always love visuals. I love to see the patient. It humanizes it. It gives it this really personal, feeling and reminder, right, of our own family members and such. So I thought that was a really great point as well. So Amanda, you shared some sort of tips and tricks as risk practitioners. What kinds of tips and tricks can we exercise or pull out of our hats, if you will, to help get people out of that risk funk and kind of move them in the right direction?
I mean, I'm making an assumption, right, that folks that are listening to this currently have either risk champions, risk facilitators, individuals that are trained to lead risk assessments. But if that is a poor assumption, and folks that are listening have not invested in bringing people up to speed or developing some core competencies around risk management such that you have a cadre of people that can lead risk assessments like Tiff Baker talked about, do that. That's really going to go a long way. And once you have them in place, start to think about, we talked about this a little bit. You get your Outlook meeting invite, and it says, you're going to an FMEA from 8 till 5 p.m., Monday through Friday next week. And the first thing you think is, well, how can I get out of this? Or do I really need to be there? When I send,
do I have jury duty?
Yeah.
Do I have jury duty? That might be a better option.
Is this required? Really? Suddenly everyone who's a SME on the floor is like, no. Someone else can take my role. But what I do when I send out that dreadful message is I send a flyer that says, you've been invited to a risk assessment. So now it's like, me? I'm invited because I need you to be there. And I list out the reasons why each person is there. You're here because you represent a set of knowledge or a body of knowledge from the organization that can only be achieved from you. So then I list all of the things that we'll do. We will have open and free conversation. We will listen to each other. We will acknowledge when we don't know. And things that we won't do, we won't remain silent. We won't be defensive. I try to let them know ahead of time. I know what this means from an impact perspective, and to sort of call out some of the behaviors that we've talked about already to say, hey, we all feel this way. I know it. You know it. So here's a flyer that sets that stage. And it also prepares people to know that there's a person that's coming to this risk assessment who's leading this risk assessment, and this person will monitor things, be in control of the conversation, and so that you don't have a power struggle amongst your individual team members. That might still happen, but the facilitator can help diffuse those things. And so one thing I think is really important to set the stage that way and to make it a real, just a focused flyer when you send that out. One thing that has happened during COVID is we've sort of changed the way that we train, right? Mm-hmm. So where I used to sit in the room with everyone, and you could go and nudge people if they were not paying so close attention, all those behaviors that you can kind of wake people up with. We've lost some of that personal connection. But one thing that has happened is that my clients have had an opportunity now to send more people to a virtual training where they can, attend the first couple of days, or they can attend the first few hours just to get a feel for what the topic is about. What is it like to be a risk facilitator? What is risk management? And that has been really helpful because I used to always say, when you're in facilitator training or you're training to be a facilitator, the people around you are your best allies, right? If I have a problem as a facilitator, I'm going to call Lori and say, I don't know how to control this team, or they're making me crazy. What do I do? Now I have clients where facilitators and SMEs are all taking the training together. And so suddenly there's this big brother, big sister relationship occurring where these SMEs know how to protect the facilitators. They can help diffuse situations for them. And that's been really like a welcomed and unexpected consequence of doing this online training and kind of opening it up to other folks. So just having those advanced practitioners, your risk coaches, getting them together and learning together, knowing that some folks will have a more advanced knowledge of risk management and how the mechanics of the risk management process go, but exposing people to what it is like to manage the behaviors in a risk assessment. I think holistically, we can really move ourselves into a new space to further acknowledge the dread so that we can leave it behind us.
I love that. I want to go back to your first point too. I just loved even the invitation idea. It kind of really changes, it shifts it, right? Not you're the lucky one that drew the short stick. It's more, you've been invited because your knowledge is very valuable, right? Yes. And I need that because I'm the facilitator, right? And I love how you pointed out, I'm going to be guiding the team. I'm going to be asking the questions. You can sit back, relax, and tell me your information,
Right.
Buckle up, right? Because it's
like the risk assessment should really be their opportunity to think, these are the things I know. These are the things I don't know. Yep. And I mean, it's really, what a gift to have that opportunity without solutioning right there and then. It's not a deviation investigation. It's going back to your risk curious element. And that's really that's where the real beauty of the risk management process comes in.
Yeah, I love that. They get to show their knowledge too and get the opportunity to have others help them if they don't know that space, right? Too. So Nuala, what do you have some more in-depth thoughts on kind of that concept of risk champions, coaches? I know Amanda, you also talked about that as well. I also love that piece because I just don't like to do anything by myself. I love to have partners. I love to have mentors. I love to have people to share ideas with. Can you expand a little bit more on that and maybe communities of practice as well, Nuala?
Yeah, for sure. And just in terms of that risk champion, certainly, where we do need to train folks on those facilitation skills. But again, I'm much more in the vein at this stage of my days now of seeing that we need to crowdsource risk management. Everybody's job, every dose, every day is managing risk. And so where for many years we had these SMEs who were the QRM specialists or the risk leads, I'm much more now about like devolved government around this, so that we, everybody is involved in every role that they have, that they feel their connection to the patient and their management of risk. Saying which, I do still feel the need for risk coaches because these environments, as we said, can be very stressful. And the role of the risk coach for me then is enabling everybody in that room to do their best work on the day. And so to Amanda's point there, I loved that invitation piece because the risk coach, for me, the job of the risk coach is to learn about what people need in order for them to do their best work, feel valued, feel seen and respected for who they are as individuals. So it's not just some nameless, at whatever the email address is. And we'll send a delegate if I can't bring myself to lose 2 days of my life in an FMEA. It's actually about finding out what are the things that they are good at, what are the things that they can feel valued at, because it's a fantastic opportunity, not only for personal growth for them on an individual basis, but also for them to get recognition from their peer group for the contribution that they play and the special role that the special piece of knowledge they have around the tasks and the practices. So that creating safety, that risk coach creating safety, fostering that environment that respects and acknowledges that there are different needs in the team and there are different approaches, that diversity of opinion is really valued. And that's why you need to make sure that when you're running these sessions that you don't have everybody from one side of the ship in the room, So that diversity of opinion is valued. You want to hear everybody's different consensus. As I've always said, consensus is the enemy of risk management. And so that those people then can feel that they can do their best work. And so, if we're looking at the kind of traits and behaviors, definitely listening, getting people to collaborate, encouraging them, obviously coaching them, acknowledging when something is right, when there's, something is really working well, acknowledging that in the room, but also being prepared for that courage over comfort to act if things are going south and it's not working out in the room and somebody's dominating the discussion or else you can start to feel the tension between groups. Acknowledging that, bringing that forward, and don't let it fester. Taking 5 and say, okay, I'm seeing something here. Let's all take a break. So it is, about, getting to that point where you're preempting the problems rather than finger pointing, and inspiring people in relation to what good looks like. So they're all the things that the risk coach for me has to do and manage. Perhaps some of the activities, in terms of scribing and stuff like that. It may be helpful if you have, particularly if it's a large activity, that you have a second scribe if you can, so that they can really be watching the people and getting the best out of the people and making sure there's no silence, like Amanda said. In terms of those communities of practice, then, I see a real value in those risk coaches getting together, across sites or across the industry, of getting together to share stories of and tips and techniques of how to do this well. We don't use group theory enough in my experience. We use a lot of these risk assessments and investigations and CAPAs and deviations. We do single point solutions. Sometimes they're good and sometimes they're band-aids, but in any event, our compliance processes drive us towards we have a unique identifier and it's a single point solution. And we're not then coming back in a community of practice and looking at group theory of, how did the last 5 sessions go, or how did the last quarter of investigations go, and how, what worked well, what didn't work well, what behaviors were helpful and which weren't, and look at it, how can we strengthen our processes like that? So that's where I think that learning community, that coming together to share best practice, not about individual risk assessments or individual events, but actually of saying, how are you guys getting on and what's working well for you?
Oh, I absolutely am a huge fan of community of practices, just to even get things going when you're first building a program, just to get people talking, and some people are already facilitating, but they've never really been trained. What are your pain points, right? I love all this. Okay, so I think we've covered so much. We've moved from that risk funk to kind of the tools and tips and behaviors we want to see to get us out. I'm feeling the light now. So Amanda, how do we get people to live the risk life?
I think the first most operable thing is to start creating scenarios where people are participating and have good experiences or great experience. Good would be a good start, right? And then great experiences with the risk management process. It made me think a lot of risk assessments are done at small facilities and at really small startups, and they go relatively unrecognized across an organization. But if there is a risk assessment that is needed to disposition a batch and it gets done in record time, or the deviation rate is narrowed to near zero, then there's a pizza party and there's a huge celebration and the bonuses are abound. So we need to begin tying back, and creating a culture of acknowledgement of these individuals who are working on these prospective assessments. I'm not saying every time an FMEA is completed that you have a party for them, but maybe create some sort of announcement. Hey, this group of people spent X number of hours together, and this was the risk assessment that they did, and these were the outcomes, and this is what we're preventing as a means of this. So I think we're lacking in that recognition. And that goes a long way. People like to be recognized for the hard work that they do. I know a few risk assessments that I've done where we've identified significant vulnerabilities and mitigated them in silence, when the site would have benefited from understanding, this was the risk profile before and this is the risk profile after. I mean, significant changes were made to overcome that, but they just come through as change requests or change controls. They don't come through as the result of a prospective risk assessment. And ultimately, living that risk life, consider the concepts we've talked about today and look at your organization and find where are things going well. Is the where things are going well, people go to the risk assessments, but they don't continue going? Diagnosing, like, what is the reason that they don't continue to come? Or is it that you can't get them to show up at all? But enhance what's going well. Find those areas of positivity, and where they're not going well, lead with compassion. Remember the shame, the fear of blame, those human parts that come in, right? The gray that we're afraid to navigate. Moving the needle compassionately, I think, will get us to a really strong point where we're safe to live the risk life and to put sort of our dread behind us.
Oh, I love that. I love the celebration piece of it and leadership really acknowledging those activities. And I think to your last point too, I just wanted to add on to that when we are risk curious and we've taken a calculated risk, we communicated that risk, we knew that what the impact of that risk would be, and that risk is realized. I think it's also really important that leadership accept that risk acceptance accountability, if you will, and go, okay, we knew that risk was possible. We had this continuity plan in place. We took those actions, and we're okay, right? I think that can really kill things really quick too. When risk was escalated, risk was communicated, risk acceptance was documented, and then everybody goes, that risk was realized. You didn't say any, and we did say something, and then it drives down that risk curious. I don't want to bring up risk now. I don't want to accept any risk even. So I think I love what you're saying there. I think I just wanted to add on to that just even those kind of actions too by leadership can really enable that culture too. 100%. And then Nuala, you talked a little bit about some business processes, metrics too, that we need to consider for living that risk life,
Yeah, and it picks up on nicely on what Amanda's saying there about the recognition. For me, we absolutely have to build recognition and reward into our systems. We have them in our organizations. We rarely apply them for risk management activities. And actually that brings me to a whole other point, which is, for me, risk management and operational excellence are two sides of the one coin. And so, from the opening statement where we said, risk is a problem, it's seen as a negative constraining factor rather than an opportunity to strengthen our processes and strengthen, reduce the risk to the business. For me, we should be looking at risk management and partnering that with our operational excellence colleagues in the OpEx program. And that will bring with it the rigor around defining what your outcomes are, rather than them going under the radar because they're coming through on a change management or a part of a CAPA. But actually defining your outcomes and then measuring those. So we routinely on an OpEx project would have return on investment, defined in terms of, number of uptime, increased uptime on the hours, or reduced downtime, or increased yield, or increased productivity. You rarely see on a continuous improvement project, unless I've been in there shaking the tree, let's quantify the reduction in risk that we have as a result of removing the vulnerabilities, as Amanda said. So cost of quality is another. I know it's a metric that people shy away from. We don't have to be forensic accountants to apply this. We can apply it in a fairly simple rule of thumb way of saying, an investigation or a deviation at this level, critical, major, minor, takes this number of man hours, and then apply, a number of dollars as an FTE on that. And then very simply set some targets for teams. So if we have done this prospective risk assessment, the intention is that, you're going to have limited deviations or errors or preventable errors happening. Well, set a target on preventable errors and have that whole team in the post-approval stage of the commercialization process track that. And that will help them to strengthen where there may still be weaknesses once we hit the ground running at volume. And it allows us then to recognize and reward them on the basis of those outcomes being realized. And they've got a continual improvement target to move for. So for me, the most practical thing we can do to make this living the risk life is marry your risk management program to your operational excellence Lean Six Sigma program, same mindset, same people, and start getting some real, meaningful metrics that matter to the business in play. And then reward and recognize on the basis of those metrics. So it's not a one and done, and then it's buried in the file, or it's buried in a CAPA and you don't see it again. Make it part of the everyday workflow.
I love that. And I just wanted to add too that I love the idea of bringing, I see cost of quality has kind of disappeared a lot of times in the industry. And I had a previous boss that we used to call it the cost of no quality, right? And we always thought that sometimes the connotation was it was the cost of the sort of having a quality organization. It really wasn't. It was really the cost of not having quality processes in place. So we were advocating changing it. Maybe perhaps that would sort of give it new life again. Because I think there's so much there, Nuala, that doesn't get connected with risk management. So I want to thank both of you, all of us, I guess, for sharing our thoughts. Again, another engaging dialogue that I could keep going on with, but I think we definitely need to wrap up for today. And I think Nuala, Stacey, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, such a great discussion and an important one for our listeners to hear, because I think it is important that we recognize sort of that dread that might come along with this and help to move people past that, really, because you need the engagement and the buy-in for it to happen correctly. So thanks for that great discussion. Nuala, remind our listeners of the takeaways from today's episode.
Yeah, well, and the number one article I'll post is that Khalil Jameson article on judging and joining behaviors. I think that will really help. And then we've also, in honor of Amanda, we've also got a lovely article that Amanda and Jim Vesper wrote on facilitation. And it's got some nice soft skills mentioned in there as well. So we'll post those two to start with anyway.
Fantastic. Those will be included in the show notes. So thank you once again to our Risk Revolution leaders, Lori and Nuala, and of course, to their guest, Amanda McFarland, for sharing your expertise. Really, really appreciate the stories and case studies, which make up these discussions and really make them so real. Also, a shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen. And most importantly, I'm sending out my appreciation to you, our valued listeners. I'm grateful for your time each week and for your help in sharing this podcast. Together, we can keep spreading the word. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, please remember to subscribe in your podcast player of choice and be sure to share it with your friends, colleagues, and online networks so they can enjoy it too. Plus, send us a quick note or leave an online review. We'd love to share your feedback with our networks. For show notes and additional podcasts, including links to the takeaways from today's episode, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com/podcast. We'll be back again next week with another lively and insightful discussion. Until then, make it a great week.